Just ahead on American Black Journal, a look back at the summer of 1964 when hundreds of volunteers traveled to Mississippi to get blacks registered to vote. We'll talk with two of the men who participated in Freedom Summer. Plus, Detroiters get ready to show their pride at the 8th annual Arise Detroit Neighborhoods Day. We'll have the details next, so stay with us.
At DTE Energy, we believe that we have a greater responsibility. We believe that being part of a community means being involved in the fabric of that community, investing time, effort, and resources in the communities we serve. DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of American Black Journal.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. 50 years ago this summer, hundreds of mostly white college students from across the country descended on Mississippi to help register black voters. The crusade was organized by local civil rights groups and was known as Freedom Summer. At the time, Mississippi was one of the country's most segregated states, and the volunteers were met with harassment and violence, which included the murders of 3 workers. Recently, PBS aired a film about Freedom Summer that can now be viewed online at pbs.org. Here's a clip.
I don't want the Negro as I have known him and contacted him during my lifetime to control the making of a law that controls me, to control the government under which I live.
I don't think people understand how violent Mississippi was. If black people try and vote, they can get hurt or killed.
You're not a registered voter, you're not a first-class citizen.
They would say, "You're right, boy. We should be registered to vote." But I ain't going down there to mess with them white people.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 students from all around the country who will engage in freedom schools, voter registration activities, and open up Mississippi to the country.
We face absolute extinction of all we hold dear. We must be strong enough to crush the enemy.
The 3 civil rights workers who disappeared in Mississippi last Sunday night still have not been heard from.
It was always in the back of everybody's mind that bad things were going to happen. But if you cared about this country and you cared about democracy, then you had to go down.
The Detroit chapter of the National Lawyers Guild sent several members to the 1964 Freedom Summer to provide legal support for the volunteers. I'm pleased to welcome 2 of the attorneys who traveled to Mississippi 50 years ago. Richard Goodman of the Goodman Callahar Law Firm in Detroit and retired attorney Alan Zemmol. Welcome to American Black Journal.
Thank you, Steve.
Boy, watching that footage, it's really hard to sort of fathom just how violent that summer was, how violent Mississippi was at that time. 50 years is sort of a long time, but it's not that long ago. I mean, there are lots of people around now who would remember that, including you 2 gentlemen.
That's right.
Yeah. So tell me about what it was like when you got to Mississippi in that summer.
Well, just real quickly to put it in context, in 1963 or 4, the Congress and the President enacted the voting rights bill.
65.
65, excuse me. And that was a consequence, one of the consequences of the 1964 summer.
Of the registration.
Yeah, and of course it remained for a long time a cornerstone of voting rights in the South and elsewhere. But the violent summer of '64 led directly to that that law, which I don't think any of us want to forget.
Right.
The atmosphere. We were in various towns and cities throughout the state of Mississippi, and violence was omnipresent. It was everywhere. The suggestion of violence was very much felt in the streets and visible. some of the houses we stayed in with the kids who were doing the actual registration were blown up. I was in one of those houses, not at the time of the explosion, but just afterwards. The kids and the local African-American communities in Mississippi are the real heroes of that period of time. We were there primarily to try and do everything to protect the legal rights and to kind of teach the legal rights that people already had,
right,
and how to exercise them and what the procedures to follow. And the people who were there, you know, involved in the struggle were heroic in terms of just being willing to face the Klan, which, by the way, was very apparent in the streets. Right. And the people who didn't wear the white robes and the hoods and so forth were their brothers in arms. Right. And so you were looking at the sheriff one day, or the deputy sheriff, or the judge even, and you know the same night they go and put on their
a hood.
So it was infiltrated. The Klan had infiltrated the entire legal structure of Mississippi. Right. It was a tremendous influence, hateful influence.
Yeah, Alan, I'm wondering, as a lawyer, you're there to try to assert people's rights or get people to be able to assert their rights, but this is sort of a lawless, you know, as Richard's pointing out, it's sort of a lawless state. I mean, how effective could you even be in that?
Well, interestingly enough, well, first I want to point out that Richard makes the really good point, and that is that the real heroes were the people of Mississippi,
sure,
who remained there after we left and were there long before we got there, and they had to deal with the consequences. Sure. And the mood was terrible. Yeah. You sensed danger everywhere, even though personally I didn't experience, but it was in the air. Yeah. And it was an opportunity, I found it to be an opportunity to fulfill some of my goals as an attorney.
Right.
One of the things, I know this sounds corny to many people, but I was very moved by the oath that I took to be an attorney to uphold the Constitution of the United States.
Sure.
And that meant a great deal and still does. So we had to deal with that kind of situation. I had an interesting experience. I and my partner, Roger Craig, also from this area, we observed voter registration that was led by Stokely Carmichael.
Right.
And everything was very hush-hush because it was very dangerous. But unfortunately, somehow there was a leak, and we got to this first town, the name of which I can't remember, and there were 6 guys in the courtroom, in the entrance to the courthouse, with blackjacks in their hands, and there was nobody on the street. It was like noon during the middle of the week. No one was on the street, and it was incredibly intimidating. And I told Roger, keep your jacket buttoned, your tie up, and look like an SOB, and maybe they'll think we're from the FBI. And that's exactly what happened. Stokely came in with the voters, and they were very polite to him. They said the registrar is not here, and they sent us to another town. And we went to the other town, and there, as we were driving there, and you have to understand the highways in the Delta are 2 lanes, and nobody speeds.
Right.
And we were passed coming into that town by a very officious-looking unmarked car, and when we left, that car pulled alongside of us, and the fellow driving it looked like a classic beefy policeman, and he saluted us.
Is that right?
So we knew we had pulled off our subterfuge.
Right.
We went to the next town, and before just at the entrance to the courthouse, there was a car with its hood up, and 6 guys with baseball bats, apparently fixing the engine.
Yeah. Right.
Somebody came out, as we pulled up, somebody came out of the courthouse, must have told them to leave because they all put down the hood of the car and fled. The voters came in and they registered, and we followed them out. And I think we were lucky.
Yeah.
The day, by the way, that this happened was the day they found the bodies of the 3 civil rights
of the 3,
workers.
yeah.
It was a very moving time.
It strikes me that you know, this was an effort to get black voters registered and get them obviously to vote in Mississippi at a time when the power structure did not want that to happen. I wonder though, as attorneys, do you see some of the things that are going on now with enhanced requirements for voter ID. I mean, some of the arguments that we're having in not so much in Michigan, but certainly in some neighboring states about that. Does that seem to you to be born of the same barrier?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question, because to me it's so ironic, really, that the legal issue was that the center of the struggle in Mississippi was the right to vote.
Vote, sure.
And everybody understood, this right to vote goes the power to make laws and to form, to create the conditions where people can live in peace.
Right.
And that was the underlying whole core of the movement. And today, it was being destroyed by the Klan and in the white robes and so forth.
Right.
Today, we have many of the same things going on in different ways, more subtle and so forth, with people being denied, again, the right to vote, sure. Pretext, subterfuge, voting identification, all these things which are being placed in the way of minority voters and other voters, again, to destroy their democratic rights. This time it's being reinforced not by people in white robes, but by people in black robes.
By judges,
that's
right.
That's really the difference.
Yeah. I agree with what Richard says. There is an underlying message here. Evil never stops. It may be interrupted, it may be impeded, but it's always there. Sure. And you have to be prepared to deal with it. And it takes different forms. People are much more sophisticated now. Violence worked for many, many years.
Right.
Now it's being done legislatively,
sure.
judicially, but it's still discrimination and subjugation.
Yeah. I tell this story a lot about how recent this all was, and the example I use is that my father was born in 1933 in Mississippi, and as a result of when he was born, he was not able to vote in his home state until he was more than 30 years old, after that Freedom Summer and after the Voting Rights Act. And I always tell that story to say, this is not some distant relative I read about in a book. This is my parent, the first person I knew. So it's really not that long ago that all of this stuff happened.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right.
I just don't think you can underestimate the evil, as Ellen said, that was involved here. I remember a girl who was in the house I was staying in, a young woman who had been hurt in the explosion, and she broke down during one of the meetings we were having. And I remember her crying and saying, where does the hate come from?
Right.
Why do they hate me?
Right.
And why do they hate everybody?
Right.
And what's the reason for it? But much of that's still there, and it's whether it's aimed at the President of the United States, which a lot of it is.
Which a lot of it is now. Right?
It's still in the streets.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's pervasive, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of different forms. Just before I remembered one of the young men that I met down there was in Greenwood was Silas McGee.
Uh-huh.
And about a week or so after I got back, there was a news report that he was shot. And just recently, I looked up Google, and there was a report written in 2010 by a woman who actually helped take him to the hospital.
Uh-huh.
And it was a very harrowing experience where he was bleeding, and he was brought in, and they couldn't take him because he went to the white entrance.
Because he went to the wrong.
And then they had to move him to the black entrance and call a black doctor in town to look at him. And ultimately, his life was saved. But
that's
scary stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's great to have you guys here, and of course, I think the entire community would thank you for what you did 50 years ago.
It was our pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Privilege.